Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Deep Dive. You guys requested it,
Yeah.
and we are going to deliver. Today, we're diving into the Iran-Iraq War.
All right.
We've got a whole stack of your sources here, and let me tell you,
Yeah.
this conflict, it's a lot more than just some boring history lesson, right? It's a whole tangled mess of global politics and,
Oh, yeah.
military blunders, and
Absolutely.
it's human drama.
A lot of human drama, yeah. It really shaped the Middle East today, the modern Middle East, and you can still feel the ripple effects
Totally.
even today.
Oh.
I specialize in military strategy and Middle Eastern history, and even I was surprised by some of the things I learned getting ready for this.
I bet.
Okay.
Okay, so
Deep dive.
before we get into all the crazy details and stuff, can you just give us a quick
Yeah.
rundown? What caused this whole mess in the first place? What was going on between Iran and Iraq?
Well, you got to understand, these two countries have a history.
Yeah.
It goes way back. I'm talking centuries of religious disputes, territorial disputes. They were always fighting for power in the region. One of the big ones, though, was this waterway, the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Super important for shipping.
Right.
And it formed part of their border. So
I see.
they were always fighting over that.
That makes sense. Didn't they try to make a deal about it back in the 70s?
They did. They signed this thing called the Algiers Agreement in 1975. And Iraq basically said, fine, Iran, you can control the eastern bank of the waterway. It seemed like, okay, finally we settled this thing.
Right.
But then
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein enters the picture
Of course.
with his own,
Ambition.
ambitions. Yeah. Saddam was not a rule follower.
No.
He wanted to make Iraq the top dog in the Persian Gulf. And he saw Iran, especially after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, as a big problem.
So he basically saw Iran in chaos, right, after the revolution.
Yeah.
And decided to make his move.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, and they were so sure they would win a quick victory.
Yeah, they thought Iran's military would be totally messed up after the revolution.
Exactly. They thought they could just walk in and take over.
Mm.
But that did not happen.
It did not go according to plan.
It did not go according to plan at all.
Did it?
It was a huge miscalculation.
Yeah.
They really underestimated how tough the Iranian people were and how much they wanted to defend this new Islamic Republic.
Yeah, I was reading that the Iranian military, even though they were kind of weak at first, they adapted and reorganized really fast.
They did, yeah.
And they even had these groups, the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij, who were super loyal to Ayatollah Khomeini.
Yes. The Revolutionary Guard, or the IRGC.
Right.
They were a whole different thing compared to the regular Arma. They were driven by their ideology. They were fanatically loyal to Khomeini, and they used these unconventional tactics that really confused the Iraqis.
Yeah. So basically Iraq, thinking they could just roll over Iran,
Yeah.
totally backfired.
Big time.
And this set the stage for this long and really bloody conflict.
Right.
Way more than anybody expected.
Yeah. And it wasn't just a military miscalculation.
Right.
It was also a miscalculation about the politics and the social dynamics going on. They really just didn't understand what they were getting into.
Yeah. It's like they didn't even do their homework.
Exactly.
They just charged in head first.
And they paid the price.
Okay, so we've got this setup,
Yeah.
historical tensions, Saddam's ambitions, and this huge miscalculation by Iraq.
Right.
What happens next? Where do things go from here?
Oh, things get really messy really fast.
I bet.
There are some major turning points in the war, some battles that really show just how crazy and back and forth this whole thing was.
Okay, I'm ready. Tell me more.
All right, well, one battle that really stands out is the Battle of Desful in 1981.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that one. That seemed like a turning point, but in a kind of weird way, right?
Absolutely. So, picture this. Iran, still trying to use their old military playbook from before the revolution, launches this huge tank offensive.
Okay.
They're thinking, all right, we're going to smash through the Iraqi lines. We're going to turn this whole war around.
Classic tank warfare.
Exactly. Send in the big guns, shock and awe.
Yeah, shock and awe.
But there's a problem.
Oh, no.
They send in all these tanks without enough infantry support.
That's not good.
No, it's not good at all.
So, no protection on the signs.
Exactly. And no way to really take advantage of any breakthroughs.
So they're just, wide open.
Totally exposed. Like a boxer leading with their chin.
Ooh, that's a good analogy.
And you know what happens when you lead with your chin? You get knocked out.
Ouch.
And that's basically what happened to the Iranians. The Iraqis, they had anti-tank weapons. They had their own tanks. And they were ready. They ambushed these Iranian tank columns.
Oh,
It was a total disaster for Iran.
I can imagine. A total bloodbath.
It was bad. And you know what? This defeat, it actually forced Iran to rethink their whole approach to the war.
Yeah.
They realized they needed to change things up.
Interesting. So this is where they ditch the tank-heavy strategy and start using those guerrilla-style tactics, right? Like we were talking about before.
You got
Yeah.
it. Human wave attacks, ambushes, hit-and-run raids. They basically turned the war into this brutal, grinding stalemate where Iraq's fancy weapons and bigger army don't give them as much of an advantage.
Okay, so we're starting to see the war shift in a different direction.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out a bit. We can't talk about the Iran-Iraq war without talking about all the other countries involved. This whole thing becomes a major proxy war.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah.
So where the Cold War gets really tangled up in the Middle East, you've got the U.S., the Soviet Union, all these European countries, even some Arab states. They're all picking sides, sending weapons and money.
Oh, wow. So walk me through this.
Okay.
So it's backing who?
Okay.
And, like, what are their goals?
Okay, so the U.S., even though they had some doubts about Saddam at first, and for good reason, they start siding with Iraq.
Really? Why would they side with Saddam? He's like a brutal dictator.
He was, but the U.S. was freaked out about Iran's Islamic Revolution. They
Right.
were worried it would spread and destabilize their allies in the Middle East and threaten their interests there.
So they're thinking, the enemy of my enemy is my friend,
Exactly. Realpolitik at its finest.
even if that friend is, a terrible person.
Yeah, even then. They saw Saddam as a way to stop Iran's influence, so they overlook some of his less desirable qualities.
Okay, so the U.S. is backing Iraq. What about the Soviet Union? They must be on Iran's side, right?
You'd think so.
Yeah.
But it's never that simple in the Middle East. The Soviets actually played both sides for a while.
Wait, really? They were selling weapons to both Iran and Iraq.
Yep. They wanted to stay influential in the region, and they also wanted to make money, so they tried to keep everyone happy.
Wow, cynical. But I guess it kind of makes sense. But eventually they had to pick a side, right?
As the war dragged on, they leaned more towards Iraq, partly because Iran became more isolated internationally, and partly because they thought Iraq would be a better partner long term.
So we've got this whole mess of different countries involved, all with their own agendas. And they're just making this war even worse.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster. And speaking of disaster, we have to talk about one of the darkest parts of this conflict. The use of chemical weapons.
Yeah, that's something I definitely wanted to ask you about. That's just horrific. Like, how could they?
It was widespread and absolutely awful. Iraq, especially, used mustard gas and nerve agents
Oh, God.
against both Iranian troops and civilians, and it caused massive casualties and long-term suffering.
I read that the U.S. knew about Iraq's chemical weapons program, but still kept supporting them.
That's right. And there's evidence that they even gave Iraq intelligence to help them make those chemical attacks more effective. It's a dark chapter in U.S. foreign policy for sure.
It's hard to believe that a country that says it cares about human rights could be involved in something so terrible.
It is. But, like we've seen throughout history, sometimes practical concerns outweigh ideals. In the Cold War, stopping what they saw as the threat of Iran was more important to them than making Saddam pay for his crimes.
Yeah, that's messed up. Okay, so we've got these horrible chemical attacks,
Yeah.
this whole tangle of countries interfering,
Right.
and this war that just keeps dragging on and on.
Exactly.
What about the human cost of all this? I mean, millions of lives were lost or ruined. Can you give us a sense of how bad the suffering was?
It's almost impossible to grasp the scale of this tragedy. Estimates for the total number of dead range from 500,000 to over 1 million people.
Oh my God.
And that's just the deaths.
Right.
Countless more were wounded, physically and mentally scarred. They were forced from their homes, and they lived with the trauma of war forever. It was devastating.
One thing that really hit me while I was researching this was the child soldiers, especially the ones used by Iran. It's heartbreaking to think about these young boys, barely teenagers, being sent to fight.
It is one of the most horrific parts of this war. Iran was running out of soldiers, and they had this idea that dying in battle was a good thing.
Yeah, like a martyr.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they sent thousands of these young boys to fight, often with barely any training or equipment.
I read accounts of them being used to clear minefields, like walking across them until a mine exploded. It's just awful.
It is. It really shows you how brutal and desperate this conflict was. People were willing to do anything to win, even sacrifice their own children.
So we've got this war that drags on for years. Both sides are losing so many people, other countries are meddling, and it just feels like there's no sense of right and wrong anymore.
Yeah, it's a dark picture for sure.
Where do things go from here? How does this all end?
Well, as the war grinds into the late 1980s, both sides are just exhausted. Their economies are in ruins, and the rest of the world is finally starting to put pressure on them to stop fighting.
So there's a little bit of hope.
There is, but it comes at a terrible cost. There are
Ah.
some truly awful things that happen before the fighting finally stops.
Okay, well, let's take a break here and we'll come back and talk about the end of the war and the lasting impact of this conflict.
Sounds good.
So we left off with this, like, glimmer of hope, but a terrible cost. What finally ends this war?
Well, a ceasefire finally happens in 1988, but it happens after some really awful stuff goes down. One of those things is the Halabja chemical attack in 1988.
Right, wasn't that one of the worst chemical attacks ever?
It was just horrific. Iraqi forces used chemical weapons on this Kurdish town, Halabja,
Right.
and they killed thousands of civilians.
Oh my God.
Women, children. It's considered one of the worst examples of chemical warfare in modern history.
I can't even imagine. We've been talking about how brutal this war was.
Yeah.
But that attack is just on a whole other level.
It is, and sadly, it wasn't the only time Iraq used chemical weapons against its own people. Saddam was ruthless, both to his enemies and to anyone he thought was a threat inside Iraq.
Okay, so you've got this horrific attack.
Yeah.
And it seems like finally the rest of the world is realizing that this war is totally out of control.
Right.
How does that affect the push for peace?
Well, the Halabja attack, all the people dying, and the fact that both countries were going broke,
Yeah.
it really forced Iran and Iraq to come to the negotiating table.
So they basically had to agree to a ceasefire.
Pretty much.
Not because they actually wanted peace, but because they couldn't afford to keep fighting.
You got it. By 1988, both sides were exhausted and sick of war. Plus, the rest of the world was really worried about how unstable the whole region was becoming because of the fighting.
So after 8 years of fighting, they finally agreed to a ceasefire. Then what?
Well, the ceasefire was only the first step.
Right.
It took years of talking to actually make a formal peace agreement, which they finally signed in 1990.
Okay.
But even then, the war really messed things up.
Yeah.
And you can still see its effects in the Middle East today.
Let's talk about that. What were some of the long-term impacts of this war? I mean, we've talked about the deaths, the suffering, all the political games, but what are some of the things people might not realize were caused by this war?
Well, one major impact was the rise of the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, in Iran. They went from this revolutionary force to being a major player in the government and the economy.
Right. We talked about them earlier, but it seems like their power went way beyond just the military.
Totally. The war gave them a chance to become even more powerful. They got control of important parts of the economy. They got more influence in the government. And they became a major force in Iranian society.
So the war actually helped a group that would go on to control Iran's future. It's pretty wild.
It is, and it's something that's still affecting things today.
What about Iraq? What happened to them after the war?
For Iraq, the war was devastating. Their economy and infrastructure were in ruins. It also made the tensions inside the country worse, especially between Saddam's government and the Kurds in the north. And then, of course, there's all the brutality Saddam inflicted, which we already talked about.
So it seems like the war made Saddam stronger in a way, but it also created more problems for Iraq and the whole region.
Exactly. In a lot of ways, the war paved the way for the Gulf War in 1991 and even the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
It's like this endless cycle of violence.
It's sad, but it's true, and it shows just how long the effects of war can last. What happens in one conflict can cause another one, and so on.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Iran-Iraq War, what are some of the main things we want our listeners to remember? I mean, this has been a really intense look at a complicated and brutal conflict.
I think one of the biggest things to remember is that war is almost never a simple answer to problems. It usually causes more problems, and those problems can be huge and last for a long time.
Right, and something we've talked about a lot today is how important it is to understand what's really going on behind a war.
Yes.
The Iran-Iraq War wasn't just about those two countries. It was a proxy war, a battle in the Cold War. And it showed how deep the tensions and power struggles are in the Middle East.
Exactly. And those tensions are still there. In fact, they've gotten even more complicated in the years since the war.
So what does that mean? Are we supposed to just give up on trying to understand the Middle East? It seems so messed up.
No, not at all. I think it means we need to be humble and willing to learn about different points of view. We have to realize that there aren't easy answers in the Middle East.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for taking us through this deep dive into the Iran-Iraq War. It's been really eye-opening.
My pleasure. I hope our listeners found it informative and got them thinking.
And all of you listening, we hope this deep dive helps you understand this complicated and often overlooked conflict. It's a reminder that history is more than just dates and battles. It's about people, the choices they make, and how those choices affect us all for years to come. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, stay curious. So we left off with this little bit of hope, but also this terrible cost. What finally brings this war to an end?
Well, they finally reached a ceasefire in 1988, but not before some really awful things happened, like the Halabja chemical attack in 1988.
Right, that was one of the deadliest chemical attacks in history, wasn't
It
it?
was absolutely horrific. Iraqi forces used chemical weapons on the Kurdish town of Halabja, killed thousands of civilians, lots of women and children. It's considered one of the worst instances of chemical warfare in modern history.
It's hard to even imagine that kind of cruelty. We've been talking about how brutal this war was, but that attack, it's on another level.
It really is. And sadly, it wasn't the only time Iraq used chemical weapons against its own people. Saddam Hussein was incredibly ruthless toward his enemies and toward anyone he saw as a threat inside Iraq.
Okay, so we've got this horrific chemical attack. It seems like finally the international community is realizing this war has gotten totally out of control. How does that affect the push for peace?
Well, the Halabja attack, along with the war's just massive casualties and the drain on both countries' economies, really put pressure on them to negotiate.
So they're basically forced into this ceasefire, not because they actually want peace, but because they just can't keep fighting anymore.
That's pretty much it. By 1988, they're exhausted and sick of war. The international community is getting more and more concerned about the instability the war is causing in the whole region.
So after 8 years of fighting, they agree to a ceasefire. What happens then?
Well, the ceasefire is just the first step.
Okay.
It takes years of negotiations to come up with a formal peace agreement. They finally signed that in 1990. But even then, the war left lasting scars, and its legacy continues to shape the Middle East today.
Let's talk about that legacy. What were some of the long-term impacts? I mean, we talked about the death toll, the human suffering, the political games, but what are some of the things people might not realize were caused by this war?
One major impact was a rise of the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, in Iran. They came out of the war a lot more powerful. They had a lot more political and economic power, a lot of influence over the Iranian government.
Right. We talked about your military role earlier.
Yeah.
But their influence went way beyond the battlefield, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The war gave them a chance to really increase their power. They took control of some important parts of the Iranian economy, increased their influence within the political system, and really established themselves as this major force in Iranian society.
So the war actually strengthened a group that would go on to play a huge role in shaping Iran. That's pretty amazing.
It is. It still has repercussions today.
What about Iraq? How did the war affect them?
Well, the war was devastating for Iraq. Their economy and infrastructure were destroyed. It made internal tensions worse, especially between Saddam Hussein's regime and the Kurdish population in the north. And of course, you can't forget about Saddam's brutality, which we've already discussed.
It seems like the war strengthened Saddam's grip on power, but also created more instability and conflict, both inside Iraq and in the region.
You're right. In many ways, the war set the stage for the Gulf War in 1991.
Right.
And even the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003.
It's like this chain reaction of violence. Each conflict leads to the next.
It is, and it shows the long-term effects of war. The decisions made during conflicts, the actions taken, have impacts that can last for generations.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Iran-Iraq war, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? This has been a pretty heavy look at a complicated and brutal conflict.
I think one of the main takeaways is that war is rarely a simple solution. It often creates unexpected consequences that can be really destructive and far-reaching.
Yeah. Another takeaway is something that's come up again and again is how important it is to understand the big picture of a conflict. The Iran-Iraq war, it wasn't just between those two countries. It was a proxy war, a Cold War battleground. And it reflected the deep tensions and power struggles that have been going on in the Middle East for centuries.
You got it. And those tensions haven't disappeared. In fact, you could argue they've become even more complex since the Iran-Iraq war.
So what's the lesson? Should we just give up trying to understand the Middle East? It seems like a hopeless mess.
No, not at all. I think the lesson is that we need to approach these issues with humility, with a willingness to learn, to understand different perspectives. There aren't easy answers in the Middle East.
That's a good point. I want to thank you for guiding us through this deep dive into the Iran-Iraq War. I learned a lot.
It's been my pleasure. I hope our listeners found it informative and thought-provoking.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive helped you understand this complex and often overlooked conflict. It's a reminder that history is about people, the choices they make, and how those choices affect everyone for years to come. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious.